All right, lecture 13C. So I've talked about Indian Ocean trade and how this increased in volume and extent and regularity during the period from 900s to 1200s. I also want to talk about another aspect of this. Now, previously we saw that with the Silk Roads, for instance, when trade starts to spread, you also see religions spread along trade routes. And a similar thing is happening with both Islam and the Indian religions of Hinduism and Buddhism. As these trade networks increase in size and regularity and extent, you start to see these religions spread also. Now, I've talked a little bit about Islam. Islam spread fairly slowly after the Umayyad conquests. Islam spread. People converted to Islam in fairly large numbers, although it took a while in the Muslim Empire. And we saw that Islam spread into Central Asia and converted the Turks, etc. But Islam spread fairly slowly throughout the Indian Ocean, partly because Muslims weren't trying to convert people necessarily, but it spread along with the trade routes. And so you see a number of things happen. First of all, down the east coast of Africa, Muslim merchants, both Persian and Arabic speaking, would establish trade depots down the east coast of Africa. And you see Islam begin to spread there, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a later lecture on sub-Saharan Africa. You also see that Muslim merchants begin to establish trade depots and warehouses and such on the west coast of India. And from there, you start to see Islam spread slowly throughout India. India has, I believe, the largest Muslim population in the world of any country today. And that's basically not because the Turks and the Sultanate of Delhi, because they really didn't convert many people. As I mentioned, the Turks were so brutal in conquering northern India that the Indians were sort of turned off. But in southern India, with trade, you begin to see Muslim people converting to Islam because of Muslim trade activity. And I mentioned previously that Muslims often saw other Muslims as more trustworthy to trade with because they shared this common religion and the sort of morality bound up with that religion. And so many people found that it was easier to deal with Muslim merchants if you converted to Islam. They trusted you more, and it got you into the network. So there's sort of an incentive there for conversion to Islam, although, as I mentioned, it was a fairly slow process in India. But the thing that is interesting about Islam in India is that it offered people, it was attractive to people as a religion because it was not tied to the caste system. Now, we saw already with the Bhagavad Gita that in India the religion of Hinduism is so closely tied to the caste system. If you fulfill your moral duty in life is to fulfill the duties of your caste, and if you succeed and you are a good person in terms of doing your caste duty, you will come back in the next life as a higher caste. And so in Hinduism, really, caste is so intricately tied up with the religion. But for people who are at the bottom of the caste system and are basically looking at 3 or 4 or 5 or a dozen or 100 or 1,000 lifetimes to try to rise up through the caste system to achieve moksha, to have Muslims come along and say, hey, you can go to heaven right after this lifetime, right? That's a pretty attractive idea. Right? And then when you add in the fact that in Islam there's this really radical idea that everybody is equal before God, right? That social classes don't matter in terms of the religion in Islam. A very poor Muslim is just as valuable to Allah as a very rich Muslim. And in fact, it's built in that you have rich Muslims are supposed to help poor Muslims because they're all sort of valuable in the eyes of God. And so for a lot of people in the lower end of the Indian caste system, Islam is fairly attractive. And I mentioned much previously, a long time ago, that Buddhism was attractive also for this reason, because it was egalitarian. Anybody could achieve nirvana in their lifetime, according to Buddhism, if they really dedicated themselves to it, and nobody had an advantage. It was not tied to the caste system. So Islam was attractive in that sense to a lot of people from lower in the caste, that it's a religion that doesn't sort of lock them into a lower position. They start on the same level as everybody else. But there's an interesting dynamic in religions in India. Hinduism, in Hinduism, the biggest idea is that you have the universal God, Brahma or Brahman, who is sort of the life force of the entire universe. And then you have three different avatars of that God, Shiva and Vishnu and Devi, and these represent, you know, destruction and creation and fertility. And then there are other gods in Hinduism, like Krishna, who are, I'm sorry, I said creation, destruction, fertility, and I meant creation, fertility is one, destruction is one, and then the maintenance or sustenance is another. So Shiva is the god of destruction, Devi is the god of fertility and creation, and then Vishnu is the preserver. And so Krishna is an avatar of Vishnu, an avatar of the preserver, as Vishnu is an avatar of Brahman. And so in Hinduism you can get multiple gods, but they're all seen as being avatars or manifestations of a particular god, and they're all ultimately manifestations of Brahma or Brahman. Well, when Buddhism arrived in India, or was created in India, Hinduism eventually tried to sort of co-opt Buddhism by saying Buddha was actually an avatar of, you know, etc. I'm not sure which god they pointed to, probably Vishnu. But and so they basically tried to say you can be a Buddhist and worship Buddha. He's just part of the Hindu pantheon. And a similar thing happened with Christianity. When Christianity arrived in India, lots of Hindus said basically, well, the god of Christianity is just Brahma, and Jesus is just an avatar of Vishnu. And so you can worship Jesus as part of the Hindu pantheon. Well, when Islam showed up in India, people tried to do the same thing. Oh, well, you know, Allah is just Brahma, and Muhammad is an avatar of Brahma, and probably Vishnu. But Muslims said no. Muslims said absolutely not. The first pillar of Islam is that there is one God and Muhammad is his prophet, and Muhammad is the seal of the prophet. There is not multiple gods. There are no other gods. There are no avatars, etc. Muslims simply flat out refused to play along with that sort of putting Islam as a side branch of Hinduism. And as a result, it slowed down the spread of Islam because it ran into such resistance from Hindus. But in spite of that, the attraction for the lower castes to Islam, because it was so egalitarian, did allow for the spread of Islam. And the sort of attraction for being part of Muslim trade networks allowed Islam to spread amongst Vaishyas and middle-class Indians. And so Islam does spread through India. And obviously today, you know, hundreds of millions of Indians are Muslim. But Islam and Hinduism have always had this sort of delicate and sort of antagonistic relationship, partly because of these origins. I will point out there are a couple of attempts to integrate Islam with Hinduism. The Sikh religion is essentially a fusion of Islam and Hinduism, and the Bhakti religion was an attempt for a while to blend Islam with Hinduism. But for the most part, Muslims refused to be integrated into any sort of Hindu pantheon, and so the two religions remained separate and to a certain extent somewhat antagonistic. So Islam spreads to India, and I mentioned that Islam also spreads beyond India to Indonesia. Indonesia is a majority Muslim country today because of trade between Muslim merchants in Middle East and Indonesia. And Islam would spread a little bit to China, not much. The majority of Muslims in China actually would be from nomadic peoples from Central Asia. But there were some conversions to Islam in southern China through merchant communities. So Islam spreads along these trade routes. But Hinduism and Buddhism also did to a certain extent. Now, because essentially, India is the center of these trade networks, and there's this whole trade network going east from India to Southeast Asia and then up into China. And in particular, there very quickly were established close trade networks between, or close trade ties between Malaysia and Indonesia, which are important stopover points as you turn around the corner from China to India. And so these became important stopover points in the trade networks. And so you began to see close ties develop between Malaysia, Burma, or Myanmar today, Thailand, Southeast Indonesia, all the other places in Southeast Asia, began to have pretty close connections to India. And you began to see a cultural spread of Indian culture. Now this showed up in a whole bunch of ways. One way was Indian art and architecture began to show up in these new trade-based kingdoms in Malaysia and Indonesia. You also began to see clothing styles and things like that show up there. But the religions also passed that way, and I should say food also. You began to see curries, for instance, move from India to Southeast Asia. But the religions also passed that way. Now, Hinduism is hard to transplant. Hinduism is not a great religion for spreading because it's based on the caste system, and if you're not in a society that already has the caste system, how do you place yourself? When you're, okay, I'm going to convert to Hinduism, what caste am I? Right? But you're in a society that's never had castes. So it's difficult to do that, which it doesn't make it impossible, but it is difficult. And so a far more successful Indian religion to transfer to Southeast Asia was Buddhism. Buddhism did follow trade routes across the Indian Ocean, and Buddhism did become a major religion in Southeast Asia because of these trade networks with India. And so you see a number of these kingdoms in Malaysia and Indonesia that spring up based on the wealth of trade. They often will convert to Buddhism to sort of cement those ties with Indian merchants on the east coast of India who might be Buddhist. And so you see this sort of Indian culture spread throughout Southeast Asia, Indonesia, etc., on these trade networks. And so overall, I want to point out, what we're seeing here is that trade really is a cultural spreader. That trade spreads religions, trade spreads ideas, trade spreads even foods and spices and different cuisines. Trade can spread cultural norms like about marriage and family, etc. Trade really is this integrator that brings people together and spreads ideas around. And really trade is an incredible force throughout human history as far as shaping the way human societies have developed and shaping the way ideas spread throughout human societies. They follow trade routes.